Xinyan on release was more or less a failed experiment on Hoyoverse's part. A hybrid defensive-offensive character with an identity crisis in her kit, between split scaling between her abilities and severely suffering from the jack-of-all-trades, master-of-none syndrome. Plus, being a pyro unit tuned for physical damage and buffing comes with its own host of problems. Somehow, however, Fontaine has managed to address a number of issues with her kit and actually give her multiple completely different teams to make her feel actually good. So let's talk about how strong she really is now, if you should build her, and how to get the most out of her if you do. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. Xinyan is a pyro 4-star physical buffer and debuffer, a pyro or physical DPS, as well as a pyro shielder. This ambitious and interesting kit comes with a number of problems. The main one being she doesn't have the raw stats to back up these different playstyles. Her shield skill is too weak to be a reliable defensive utility, and although it procs AoE pyro damage similar to Toma as long as you hit 2 enemies with it, it will stop this when the shield is shattered, so she is unreliable as a burgeon or burning trigger. On top of that, physical itself has been done very few favors in Genshin's meta, and not even being one of the 2 elements needed to proc superconduct, physical's only beneficial reaction, makes her team building very restrictive if you build around that playstyle. Her elemental skill does allow you to buff and debuff enemies with relation to physical damage, and with Constellations, you can mitigate the issue of her shield being destroyed, turning off the buffs. But as you may have guessed, her best performance comes from abusing her claymore weapon type, which, while used to be a hindrance, now has the amazing upside of being one of the best abusers for Xinyan's plunge, enabling and buffing. But this is only one of the solid teams she has these days, so let's get into her constellations first, and then talk about her teams. So before going into Constellations, I just did want to quickly touch on her kit because it has some weird mechanics that you have to be ready for. Her normal attack has some of the highest scaling in the game for charge attack and normal attack damage, so she's using her as a charge attack character can actually be pretty okay. And her skill has an interesting thing where if you hit 1 opponent, you get a shield. If you hit 2 opponents, you get a better shield. And if you hit 3, you also deal pyro damage intermittently. She does have a passive that reduces the amount of opponents you need to hit. So to get the pyro damage pulsing, you only need to hit 2 opponents. That's kind of weird though, because if you're using her in single target, you can't get that pulsing going, which is super annoying. Her other passive gives a buff to physical damage. Fortunately, her constellations solve some of her kit's issues and bring her up to a more respectable level, although she's definitely still a pretty weak character overall, but we'll get there. Her C1, when you get a critical, the attack speed of her normal and charge attacks is increased, which is useful because her charge attack is really good for her physical or mono pyro playstyle. So that's nice. Her C2 makes it so her burst always crits, and it forms a level 3 shield. So now you don't have to worry about this silly, level 1, level 2 stuff. Her C2 is always going to proc that level 3 shield, and you're always going to get that pulsing pyro damage. Problem is the shield. This is where the split scaling is a problem because her shield is scaled off of her defense, but you kind of want to build her for damage because her burst has a pretty good multiplier for a physical nuke. So you really don't want to build for defense. It is mitigated a little bit by her C6, which we'll get to in a minute. Her C3 gives talent levels to her skill, which is good for her shield. Her C4 makes it so her skill gives decreased physical res. The physical res shred is good, and this one's not tied to your shield. It lasts for 12 seconds regardless, so that's good. The problem is you're always going to get super conduct anyways, and this is not omni shred like Zhongli's shields, and Zhongli's shield is just better and gives more shred, so it's a really good constellation for her. But it also kind of reminds you kind of how cope her overall shield is. Her C5 gives her talent levels to her burst, which is good for her nuke. And C6 decreases your charge attack stamina consumption, which is nice. As well as, it says her charge attacks give her an attack bonus equal to 50% of her def, but it's actually for her whole kit. So something I didn't know before making this video is when I was looking her up, is that it does apply to your whole kit. So you actually want to, if you want to get the biggest nuke possible, and I don't know how worth it this is for your rotation, but you can start by doing a little charge attack, get yourself the attack boost, and then pop your ult. So when I'm showing you kind of the quick swappy teams, that's something you can incorporate into your rotation. So from here, we understand we can take Xinyan in a number of different ways, and I'll show you what I've cooked. I think you'll find it pretty fun. Starting with my favorite Xinyan team, of course, the Furina Xinyan Bennett combo is one of the strongest combos in the game, and one of the best things you can do to make a character good. The nice thing about this is Xinyan already does some solid plunge damage, or some solid pyro damage from her burst, but the really amazing thing is because whenever you're running a team with Furina, you can use an attack goblet instead of an elemental damage bonus goblet. So what that means is her burst is actually not useless even as a nuke. She's essentially lost the downside of needing to choose physical or pyro. You can do both by using an attack goblet because Furina's damage bonus buffs both the pyro and the physical. So that means her plunges are going to do huge pyro damage, and her burst is going to do huge physical damage, not restricted by the type. It's fantastic. And you want to pop her skill. Make sure you pop her skill before using her burst, so you get that shred. On this team, I don't think it's worth it to do that charge attack thing because you want to have as much time for plunges as possible. But the other nice thing is that her shield, although it's not the strongest shield, getting some interruption resistance on the shield is nice for making sure you're not staggered out of your plunges before you get to use them. Of course, plunging is pretty safe overall, but it's nice to have a bit of defensive utility. And overall, like, this is one of the better Xinyan teams around. Yes, you can shoehorn any Claymore user into this spot, but Xinyan inherently has synergies with this team, and her Claymore plunge attacks, they aren't like the very highest scaling ever, but they're in line with pretty much everyone except for D-Luke, whose are just higher for some reason. So you might think that she's just carried by the team, but she actually has some good synergy, and you're actually using all the parts of her kit in this team, so it makes her feel a lot more cohesive. And the other nice thing is if your Bennett buff expires and you still have some plunges left, which often can happen, her doing physical plunges is not that bad. You're not being buffed by Bennett, which is true, but because she's running that attack goblet, and if you still have your shield up, you've got some shred and some physical damage bonus. So she's actually doing good plunge damage that's physical. So overall, like, this team is actually good. Like, it's an actually good Xinyan team that uses all of her kit. And my Xinyan isn't even like max invested, and it was feeling amazing. So this is a great team. Another team that I cooked is the Xinyan dual physical pyro team. You're same thing. You're using that same elemental, not using an elemental goblet, you're using an attack goblet again, but this is a team that uses Xinyan's charge attacks. If you can get enough ER onto Charlotte, you can give her Thrilling Tales, a Noblesse artifact set. If you have her C4 and lots of ER subs, you can do this, and then you can pass the Thrilling Tales to Xinyan. And overall, like, this team, it wasn't as strong as this team, but it's another team that uses her full kit. It's using everything she has to offer, and it's perfectly capable of clearing. So I really liked this team as well. If you want to run physical Xinyan and use her on field, this is the team that I would recommend. But that wasn't the only physical Xinyan team that you can run. You can use her as a burst support for Raiden, and I have no idea like why this team works. I mean, I get it, and I didn't cook this team. This team was cooked by Carnivy. Make sure to go check out Carnivy. She used Chi-Chi on this team. I don't know what advantages Chi-Chi has over Charlotte, but you know, if you want to use Chi-Chi, it can work. And she did, or he, I don't know why I said she, I don't know who they are, but they did an amazing clear with C0 everyone, and so I just replicated that, and it was surprisingly not bad. Like, you're using Xinyan only for her burst, doing physical. Raiden is just doing damage, and Furina's doing damage, and Charlotte is healing. Yeah, it's weird. It doesn't really make sense, but it works. This team can easily use Thrilling Tale Charlotte because Raiden is charging, so that's why I definitely would prefer Charlotte to Chi-Chi here. And you can either Thrilling Tales to Xinyan or to Raiden. Sometimes with your rotations, you'll have to go to Xinyan and not to Raiden, but either one you do, it'll work, and Xinyan's actually doing decent work in this team, so I liked it. I had a lot of fun with it. I tried to use Xinyan for Melt Ganyu, but Ganyu's defense is so low that the shield just breaks so quickly. If you didn't know, defense, the defense of the character protected by the shield at that moment goes into how much damage the shield takes, so this doesn't feel too good. Of course, Mono Pyro, like reverse vape Furina, this team works. This team is good. Furina's vaping, obviously, and you can use Kazuha as well instead of Xiangling here and get some double swirls. And you can obviously do mono pyro Xinyan, where she's completely ignoring all of her physical in her kit, and you're just going all in on that, you know, charge attack speed increase, that high charge attack multipliers, and this is a team that can clear as well. So Xinyan actually has a lot of teams. Are they top meta? No, but are they good? Especially this one. Yes. And like, she's one of the better characters to abuse this playstyle. I wish I tested her when I was doing like back and forth testing, but like, I actually think that this is not cope. It's not worth doing like over just doing Bennett carry with Yelan, or over doing Diluc, or over Gaming, or over Hu Tao, obviously. But if you love Xinyan and you've been looking for even remotely an excuse to use her, now is the time, because this team is really, really good, and you can use this team and the other teams I showed as well. So actually, there's other physical teams you can do. I didn't really touch on like the more traditional physical teams. I did try, you know, Shenhe, you know, Fischl or Yai, and who knows who else, maybe Zhongli or something like that. But they just feel so much worse than the Farina variants that I would recommend using the Farina variants. Of course, you can substitute Fischl for Raiden. You can substitute Charlotte for another cryo here like Diona or something like that, or Chi-Chi. I always forget to talk about substitutions, but yes, you can substitute Charlotte for any cryo heal. You can substitute for Mika, obviously. Oh, I completely forgot about Mika. I don't have C6 Mika, so I obviously wasn't able to use him for the crit rate or crit damage, but using Mika here is really, really good if you have his C6, because then you can pass that crit damage to Xinyan for that physical. So that's really, really nice. Mono Pyro doesn't really have any substitutions. This one I already talked about substitutions. This team, the standard physical has lots. Like, you just need Cryo, Electro, and some stuff that does damage, hopefully. It just generally feels a lot worse than the Farina stuff. Now let's talk about her value and power level. So obviously for value, it's just not, is not there. I mean, there's so many Pyro characters, there's so many Pyro Claymore characters, there's other better options. But I guess the reality is, you know, on this team, like, sure, you can use on-field Bennett, and yeah, that's going to be better. But that requires you to put Yelan or Xing Cho in Xinyan's spot. And what's more valuable, a Xinyan or a Yelan or Xing Cho? Obviously. So, you know, if you don't have a Diluc, and if you don't have a C6 Gaming, like, I like her here way better than C0 Gaming. Okay, maybe not way better, but at least as good. Maybe it's better. Well, even regardless of whether it's better or not, I would still never recommend building Xinyan over building your Gaming as a plunge character, because as you do get more Constellations for Gaming, even if she is comparable, it's still going to be, you know, then it's still going to outscale, or Gaming's still going to outscale later on. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, of course, that Xinyan, you know, to use this team, it does require the C6 Bennett, right? Any team that's going to require that Pyro Infusion, it requires C6 Bennett. So you may not have C6 Bennett. If you don't have C6 Bennett, this team actually does still work, because you're going to be doing physical plunges. The problem is you're not going to be able to vape any of your plunges, which is a big downside. So you might, you know, lean towards this team. It's sort of like, I kind of want to do for my tier list something that lets people know that the power level is pretty high only if you pair them with a certain other character, because the reality is, you know, Xinyan's the one doing damage. Not all characters can plunge as good as she can, you know, and how much does the value play into a power level ranking? It's hard to say, because objectively she does lots of damage on this team with her whole kit. Is it worse than some other characters? Yes. Does that make it bad? No, it's pretty good. Feels pretty darn good. So maybe we'll put a pin in the power level discussion, but we'll say like it's strong if you build her. Like, how is that really so different than another character like Sino or something like that, right? He is kind of carried by his teams as well, but he's also the one doing lots of damage on his teams, and so is Xinyan. So low value because there's lots of characters that can do this sort of thing, but pretty high power because the team is just good and she is good in it. So there you go. The things you do have to consider is if you're not using this team and you are using this team, like this team performs pretty well, but Farina has a lot of teams that perform incredibly well. So to waste your Farina on a team that performs pretty well is a pretty big downside. And same with a team like this, like to use Xinyan, basically except for this team, like she just gets hard carried by her supports, and she still gets hard carried in this team for sure. It's just that she actually has like some synergy with this team. I'll have to leave it up to you whether you count her as, you know, oh, she's still trash. Like, you know, she's still trash, even though she's like really good in this team and the team performs well, she has synergy, or she's still trash because she's worse than other options. Like, I'll have to leave that up to you. In the end, it doesn't really matter. The reality is that if you build this team, your Xinyan's going to perform well. But just remember, before you decide to build Xinyan, remember, you know, what you're giving up. You're not using another character. You know, this team is good, but Farina has a very high opportunity cost to be used elsewhere, and the rest of the teams are just kind of cope. So yeah, like, I don't think Xinyan's a great character, but I think that this team actually is great. So if you want to build her and use her on this team in particular, you shouldn't feel bad. But do keep in mind, it's going to be hard to find substitutions on this team. So there you go. Also, it'd be really cool if there was a way to do super conduct and like physical plunge, but there's just not, because she's pyro. So there you go. I still don't think she's like a great character or anything. I just think that she has good team. Okay, for build guide, you don't need to level 90 her because, again, Burgeon is a terrible idea, so level 90 is not necessary. However, you know, if you're going to be using her as a main carry, level 90 is something that you can do eventually just for those extra stats, but it's definitely lower on the list because she does scale mostly off of attack, and attack is supplemented by your weapon, which you do always want to level 90, so it's not as important as many other carries. For talents, for her best team, for the plunge team, normal attack is by far the most important, but you do want to level your burst as well, because your burst is going to be doing good damage, especially if you're using the proper attack sands, attack goblet setup. You don't really need to level your skill very much. I just like having it leveled for some extra interruption resistance, and I did level it for her shielding playstyles, which you obviously will need to do if you're going to try and use her as a shielder. If you're using her on physical teams, it's still going to be normal attack. That's the most important, then burst, then skill. So yeah, the same talent priorities regardless. For weapons, Redhorn Stone Thresher is going to be her best option. She's often played with Bennett, getting boosted attack and defense, increased normal and charge attack damage. Really, really good for her overall, especially for her physical playstyles. If you're playing physical Xinyan, you can go to kachingmains.com and check out the weapon ranking. It is very detailed. And know that the new 5-star claymores like Beacon are going to be pretty high, as well as the Verdict is going to be pretty high. Even though they're not like extremely beneficial, they're still a good stat stick. Surprisingly, Song of Broken Pines, even in physical, is not as good as like Serpent Spine at R5. If you happen to have Skyward Pride, it's actually like a surprisingly solid option because it's being benefited from the physical damage goblet you're using. So its passive is actually doing work. But really any of the 5 stars, even if you don't have those, any of the 5 stars are going to perform fine. If you're using the plunge, I don't know if calcs have been done. I assume that Beacon will be very good for plunge because her elemental skill will hit the opponent and then increase her attack. So you'll at least get the first part of the passive and you'll get a lot of crit rate. The Verdict is going to be solid, but elemental skill damage not going to really matter. Just you get at least 20% attack. Redhorn's probably still going to be her best because she's in Bennett's circle, although she's not getting the normal and charge attack damage increase that she would normally get in the physical teams. So it's not going to be like as ahead of everything else as before. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if R5 Serpent Spine was like her best weapon for plunge Xinyan. If you're using her as a shield bot, Favonius Greatsword is a good idea. Luxurious Sea Lord is a pretty good free-to-play option if you happen to be around for that event, which I'm not. Akumaru is also a good option for the burst version, like for the Raiden team. And Tidal Shadow will be her best free-to-play option, giving her lots of attack and healing. So if you're using plunge Xinyan, definitely use the Tidal Shadow. If you don't have High Refined Serpent Spine or one of the 5-star options, Tidal Shadow is going to be great. For artifact stats, I was playing around with defense, so I just used 2-piece Husk to get her defense up a little bit. In the plunge team or any Farina team, Marishase Hunter is obviously going to be the best artifact set, increasing normal and charge attack damage for her physical playstyle, and then obviously giving her tons and tons of crit rate. Even though you don't use the 2-piece set when you're doing plunge, it's still her best set because the second passive is just so incredibly good. But obviously physical, like if you're doing physical without Farina, then the 4-piece Pale Flame is going to be her best. And you can of course use 2-piece Pale Flame, 2-piece Bloodstained or something like that. 2-piece attack. And then for Pyro, 2-piece attack, 2-piece Pyro, probably going to be the best. Like sure, you know, Lava Walkers is a set that will technically probably probably be her best in mono pyro, but 2-piece attack, 2-piece pyro damage will almost always be your best set just because you have better substats for it. For artifacts, as even though her C6 converts defense into attack, you are still better off using an attack stance than a defense stance, just slightly for damage. And like I said, for goblet, you know, if you're on mono pyro, you want to use pyro damage. If you're using Farina, you can use attack. And if you're using skill bot, you obviously want to go defense, and then crit rate or crit damage for your mask. The Xinyan build that I was using was this one here. These are the artifacts. It's quite good. It's not absolutely nuts, but it is quite good. You do need a fair bit of energy recharge. I'm pretty lucky to have a ton of energy recharge on all of my pieces. So because if you want to burst every rotation, especially on teams that don't have a lot of pyro characters or don't create a lot of energy, you will need a bunch of ER. It's hard to give like a recommendation because it really depends on the team that you're playing on, whether anyone's using Favonius or not. So all I can say is you're gonna have to try it out and figure it out for yourself. Like ER is such, if you've got like one specific team, then it's easier to figure out. But for the plunge team, it's not as bad because my Farina is on Fav and you're getting some Bennett particles, but you don't want to be skilling too many times with Bennett. You kind of want to just burst every rotation. So I'd recommend at least 120 and kind of go from there and see, you know, and go from there. In terms of the damage, like, yeah, my artifacts are good, but she's only level 80 out of 80 and her talents are stuck at level 8. So, you know, if you put some more time and resources into her, then she'll perform even better than mine did here. For future prospects, I think it'll be interesting to see. I think one day we'll get more physical support. Like, I think physical meta will be a thing somehow. Like, 1 or 2 characters are gonna come, you know, the physical version of Chevreuse or something. Hopefully not restricted to, for Xinyan's sake, hopefully not restricted to just cryo and electro characters, because then Xinyan's out of luck. But hopefully something that will come along that will just greatly help physical, because it needs it, right? Physical damage is in a rough place. Eula's in a rough place, but I think it's salvageable. We just need a really strong physical support because there's no strong physical carries right now. So someone that's just bonkers strong, like a Farina for physical, like really, really strong. Like Farina's been great for physical, don't get me wrong, but something even more that, because Farina lifted everything up. We need something that lifts just physical up. And I think that when that comes, I do think Xinyan will get better, but I don't recommend ever building or wishing based on future potential. But I just think it's definitely possible that something like that happens. Also, we've got Natlin coming. I don't know, like, so much of her kit's based on physical that it's hard to imagine like just pyro buffs helping her that much, but I mean, it's possible, right? An alternative to Xiangling for mono pyro teams, but it won't help her specifically. You know, other characters will most likely be raised up more than her in that scenario. But I think that, you know, like, if you love Xinyan, you've always wanted to make on-field Xinyan work, like, just get this team and play this team. It's really good. Like, don't worry that Diluc might be a little bit better. It performs so well. It's so far and above anything I ever imagined for Xinyan. It feels so good. So try that out. For Overworld, you know, she is Claymore, you know, so that's good for mining and stuff. She does physical damage, so like she's not burst reliant. She can just do good physical damage with her normal attacks. Like, she's fine. Not crazy or anything for the Overworld, but yeah. I also think she could definitely use a skin. Like, when I've seen, I like Xinyan's design, but I feel like her dress is like just a little bit like under designed, and she could use like a bit of a glow up, let her hair down like that, like we got in those cutscenes. But yeah, I think, you know, Xinyan's definitely in the best place she's ever been. So now's the time to build her if you don't already have a Pyro Plunge character. And take care, rock on.